In a small forgotten valley where the winds carried the whispers of untold stories and the river ran like a silver ribbon between the forests, there lived a frail little orphan girl named Alara whose life had been nothing but a series of endless struggles since the day she lost her parents. She lived in a broken cabin on the edge of the woods, surviving on roots, wild berries, and the kindness of chance, for no one in the nearby settlement cared enough to help a lonely child who seemed to have been swallowed by grief and poverty. Yet Alara carried in her heart a strange light, a strength that made her rise each day even when her stomach ached from hunger and her feet bled from wandering barefoot in search of food. She was gentle, always ready to share the little she had with the animals of the forest, and when the night fell she would sit by the riverbank gazing at the stars, speaking to them as though they were her family. One late evening, as the moon lifted itself above the treetops and painted the surface of the river with its pale glow, Alara heard the sound of soft sobbing carried by the wind. At first, she thought it might be an animal caught in pain, but as she moved closer, she saw a figure struggling along the river's edge. It was a girl, not much older than herself, dressed in torn native garments, her long black hair hanging in knots, and her face pale with exhaustion. She was limping badly, clutching at her leg, and each step looked like agony. Fear and compassion warred inside Alara's chest, for she had been taught to be careful of strangers, but something in the girl's eyes, dark pools filled with pain and desperation, pulled her forward. Without hesitation, Alara ran to her, offering her small hand. The native girl looked startled, as though no one had ever approached her with kindness before, and after a brief moment she accepted the hand, whispering her name in a trembling voice, Ayana. She was wounded, her ankle swollen and scratched from a fall, and she needed to cross the river to reach her people. The current that night was wild, roaring from the rains that had poured earlier in the day, and no one would dare attempt it without strength or skill. Alara, despite her frailty, tightened her grip and said softly, "I'll help you. Don't be afraid." The river before them looked merciless, but Alara guided Ayana into the cold water, feeling the current crash against her tiny body. Step by step, she held onto Ayana, whispering encouragement, refusing to let go even when her own knees buckled under the weight. The water rose to her chest, the icy grip threatening to drag her under, but she fought with every ounce of her being. Ayana leaned heavily on her, trembling, whispering prayers in her language, until finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the other bank. Both collapsed on the wet soil, gasping for air, their hearts beating like wild drums, but alive. Alara looked at Ayana and smiled weakly, saying, "You're safe now." Tears rolled down Ayana's cheeks, and she clutched Alara's hand, whispering words of gratitude. But in the shadows of the trees, unseen by the orphan, a pair of watchful eyes observed everything. Unknown to Alara, Ayana was no ordinary girl. She was the daughter of a chieftain whose people lived deep within the forest, and her injury had separated her from her protectors. The kindness Alara showed that night was not a simple act of charity but one that would ripple into destiny. After ensuring that Ayana was able to rest safely on the other side, Alara returned to her lonely cabin, shivering from the cold water and exhaustion, never imagining that the act of helping a stranger would change her entire life. She wrapped herself in her ragged blanket, trying to warm herself, and eventually drifted into restless sleep, her dreams filled with visions of rivers, storms, and dark eyes filled with gratitude. When dawn began to paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the sound of heavy hooves and distant war cries shattered the silence of her valley. Alara awoke in terror, thinking at first that raiders had come to plunder, but when she stepped outside her little cabin, her breath caught in her throat. Standing before her door were 30 fierce warriors, their faces painted with sacred markings, their spears and bows glistening in the early light, and at their front stood Ayana, her limp less severe, her eyes now glowing with strength. The warriors did not come with violence in their eyes but with solemn purpose. Alara froze, unsure whether she should run or bow, but Ayana stepped forward, raising her hand to silence the warriors. She looked at Alara with warmth and pride, then turned to her people and declared words that Alara could not fully understand, though the meaning was clear: "This child saved me." The warriors lowered their weapons, their expressions shifting from stern suspicion to deep respect. One by one, they pounded their chests in salute to Alara, a gesture of honor reserved only for the bravest. The orphan girl, who had once been invisible to the world, now stood bathed in the reverence of 30 warriors whose presence alone could strike fear into villages. Alara's heart pounded in disbelief. She had never imagined her life could matter, that a simple act of compassion could summon such power to her doorstep. Yet there they stood, waiting for her, recognizing her not as a poor orphan but as a soul touched with courage. She did not yet understand what lay ahead, nor that her journey had only begun, but in that moment she felt a warmth inside her chest stronger than any hunger, stronger than any fear. She had found something she never thought possible: family, belonging, destiny. And dear viewers, just as Alara's small act of kindness changed her fate forever, your support changes everything for this channel. If you enjoyed this chapter and want to hear the rest of the breathtaking story, make sure to hit subscribe, because every click is like standing beside Alara, giving her strength for the next chapter of her journey. The morning air was thick with anticipation as Alara stood barefoot before the 30 warriors, their shadows stretching long and dark across the damp earth, and though fear rattled inside her chest like a bird trapped in a cage, a deeper feeling grew stronger: curiosity, wonder, the trembling awareness that something extraordinary was unfolding around her. Ayana stepped closer, her limp still noticeable but her spirit steady, and with a soft smile she touched Alara's shoulder, as if to tell her that she was no longer alone, that her act of courage had bound their lives together. The chieftain's daughter spoke rapidly in her own tongue, and though Alara understood only fragments, she caught words that carried weight: family, honor, courage. One of the warriors stepped forward, tall as a tree with eyes like burning coal, and presented Alara with a carved wooden emblem shaped like the wings of an eagle, the sacred symbol of their tribe. He knelt before her as he offered it, a gesture that sent shivers down her spine, for no one had ever bowed to her, the girl who once was invisible in her own village. The other warriors struck their spears into the ground in unison, their voices rising in a chant that made the very trees tremble, a song of recognition and promise. Alara clutched the emblem to her chest, overwhelmed by the realization that these fierce protectors now saw her not as an orphan but as someone worthy of respect, perhaps even belonging. Yet with honor came responsibility, and as the chanting ceased, the leader of the warriors, a broad-shouldered man with streaks of silver in his black hair, spoke in the common tongue so that she could understand. Child, the river you crossed with our chieftain's daughter was more than water. It was a path between life and death. Few would have dared what you did. Our people owe you a debt that cannot be measured. He paused, his gaze piercing her soul. But debts are not only gifts. They are paths. And you, little one, must now walk that path. Fear flickered inside her, for she had never imagined a life beyond her lonely valley, yet when Ayana took her hand and squeezed it gently, Alara felt the courage to nod. She followed them as they turned toward the forest, her small frame dwarfed by towering warriors, her feet stumbling over roots yet always catching herself, for she knew turning back was no longer possible. The journey into the woods was like stepping into another world, the air thicker with the scent of pine and earth, the canopy above hiding the sky, the calls of unseen creatures echoing like music of an ancient age. They moved swiftly despite their size, silent as shadows, and Alara marveled at how even Ayana seemed to transform among them, her limp no longer slowing her spirit. After hours of walking, they arrived at a hidden village, a place carved from the heart of the forest, where wooden lodges rose in circles around sacred fires and children played freely under the watchful eyes of elders. As they entered, silence fell across the community, for all eyes turned to the orphan girl walking among their warriors. Murmurs spread quickly, questions whispered in tones of awe and disbelief, until the chieftain himself emerged from his lodge. He was an imposing man draped in furs, his face etched with the wisdom of countless seasons, and though his gaze was stern, it softened when it landed on his daughter alive and safe. He rushed forward, embracing Ayana tightly, his arms trembling with relief. Tears of gratitude welled in his eyes as he looked at Alara, and though he spoke little, the weight of his nod was heavier than any words. That evening, a great fire was lit in the center of the village, and the people gathered to hear the tale of how the orphan girl had risked her life to save their chieftain's daughter. Ayana told the story in vivid detail, her voice carrying across the circle, painting the picture of the wild river, the icy waters, and the tiny hands that held her steady. The people gasped, cheered, and wept, for courage so pure was rare even among warriors. When the story ended, the chieftain rose and declared, "This child has the spirit of an eagle, though her wings are yet untested. She is no longer alone. Tonight, she is one of us." The crowd erupted in a roar of approval, and Alara felt warmth rise within her chest, tears spilling down her cheeks, for she had finally found a place where she was not invisible, where she mattered. Yet even as joy filled the night, Alara noticed shadows in the eyes of the elders, whispers exchanged that carried unease. Later, as the fire burned low and the stars blanketed the sky, Ayana revealed the truth. There are others beyond the forest, she whispered, men who come with fire and steel, who would see our people broken. My fall near the river was not by chance. I was running from their scouts. They hunt us, and they will come again. Alara's heart tightened with fear, for she realized her act of kindness had entangled her in a struggle far greater than herself. The next days were filled with training, as the warriors taught her how to move silently through the woods, how to listen to the language of the birds, how to hold a bow though her arms trembled from its weight. She was clumsy, unskilled, but she never gave up, and each failure only deepened the admiration the tribe felt for her spirit. Ayana remained by her side, guiding her, laughing at her mistakes, lifting her whenever she stumbled, and slowly a bond grew between them, not just of gratitude but of sisterhood. Yet danger drew closer with every sunrise. One morning, scouts returned breathless with warnings. The enemy was near, a band of raiders armed with rifles, seeking to claim the forest. The village prepared with solemn determination, painting their faces, readying their weapons, yet they were outnumbered and outgunned. Alara stood among them, her small figure barely noticeable, but inside her burned a fierce flame, for she knew she could not stand aside while those who had given her family faced destruction. The battle came at dawn, the forest alive with the thunder of footsteps and the crack of gunfire. Warriors clashed with raiders in a storm of chaos, arrows slicing through the air, spears colliding with steel. Alara, trembling but resolute, remembered the lessons, slipping through the shadows, using her smallness as her strength. She darted behind enemy lines, cutting through their supplies, scattering their ammunition, sowing confusion among them. At one moment, a raider caught sight of her and raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Ayana leapt in front, deflecting the blow with her spear, her limp forgotten in the heat of battle. Together they fought, not with strength but with heart, and their courage ignited the warriors around them. By nightfall, the raiders, disoriented and broken, retreated into the wilderness, leaving behind silence broken only by the crackling fires. The tribe had survived. Exhausted, Alara collapsed beside Ayana, both covered in dirt and sweat, but alive, triumphant. The chieftain lifted Alara into his arms, raising her high before his people, and declared, "This orphan is no orphan. She is our daughter, our sister, our warrior." The crowd cheered, chanting her name, and for the first time in her life Alara felt whole, felt worthy, felt loved. She had crossed not only a river but the divide between despair and destiny, and in doing so had discovered that family is not always blood, it is the bond forged in sacrifice and courage. As the moon rose high and the village celebrated their survival, Alara looked at Ayana and whispered, "I thought I had nothing. But I was wrong. I have everything." Ayana smiled, tears glistening in her eyes, and squeezed her hand. The stars above seemed to shine brighter that night, as though the universe itself was bearing witness to the orphan girl who found her place among warriors. And dear viewers, just as Alara's courage transformed her life, your support transforms this channel. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more powerful journeys, because your presence here is the strength that keeps these stories alive.